Hola, scholars. We are looking at our open educational textbook today. I have two chapters. We're a little behind, so we're going to combine them together. We're going to look at the American Indian Native American Studies, Chapter 4, and Asian American and Pacific Islander Studies, Chapter 5. You can access this open educational textbook from our homepage by clicking right here. I'm going to try to go through it a little fast. It's a lot of content. There will be a break in the YouTube video for you to use when you want to review one chapter over another. So let's start with American Indian Native American Studies, Chapter 4. We start off with the learning objectives. I'm going to take us straight through to introduction. So in the introduction, it talks about the use of the names in terms of Indian, American Indian, Native, and Native American. They use them in this book interchangeably. Sometimes we also say Indigenous studies, and that usually allows for a more global context of indigeneity in terms of global indigenous populations. Typically, when you see American Indian or Native American, it's usually referring to U.S. Indian tribes or Native tribes. They talk a little bit in the intro about why we use land acknowledgement statements and what it means in terms of securing meaningful partnerships and inclusions and the stewardship and protection of cultural resources and homelands. Indigenous communities are in a interesting position in terms of being sovereign nations and yet not having been given their lands back in their entirety at all, because we all reside on lands that are unceded. Here in California specific, you're going to see that we are home to nearly 200 nations. And I would like to say that in terms of this chapter in particular, it has a very historical framework to it. There's going to be a lot of timelines on each of the tabs and pages that you're going to have important dates related to Indigenous histories here in the US. And I would point out that content warning is needed for this chapter and the next chapter. There is discussions on topics that can be emotionally distressing, especially if you've never read a lot of it. I do want to point out that this Deloria Jr., one of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe authors and historians, we have a reading from that individual in Knowledge for Justice. It's specifically on the second article, page 36, Alcatraz, Activism and Accommodation. And I do want to point out that even before page 36, that there is Remembering Alcatraz 25 Years After by Troy Johnson and Joanne Nagel. So there's some overlap with one of our textbooks. The next section is the inherent, I guess I would say, resilience of Indigenous communities. So sometimes, depending upon who you're talking with in a dominant space, they might imply that Indigenous peoples no longer exist, that Native tribes were decimated from genocide and colonialism. And yes, the decimation has occurred, but the Indigenous tribes exist and are flourishing and are finding ways to heal and embrace their knowledge and way of being and sharing it with a dominant society. So I think it's really important to understand this terminology of an Indigenous way of knowing that connects the past, present, and future survival of humankind. So it's a different way of imparting knowledge. It can be very oral tradition based in passing down narratives within generations of families. And with colonization, a lot of those practices had been decimated or discouraged, if you're looking for a gentler way of saying it. And that's part of how genocides can occur. It's not necessarily just the physical killing of a people, but it's the taking away their culture, their history, their language, their ways of being. And so, one thing with Indigenous and Native American or American Indian studies is about recentering that and using it as a way to understand groups of people and generations of people. So there's a little discussion about that. There's also a good reference for a PBS series that you might be interested in seeing more about. And then this is the first timeline that we get. So, important events in California, Indian history after colonization by the US in the 1800s. So, I would read through the timeline slowly. It talks a little bit about missionization in terms of the California mission systems and how the Spanish were used as a way of taking labor from the indigenous communities in order to build these facilities, these religious facilities, and this notion of saving the Indian, so to speak, as a means of justifying atrocious acts. So they do a little kind of highlight or case study of one group, and you're going to see that throughout as well. So here's another one. This is the Hoopa Valley tribe in Northern California. Here is the Chumash Ohlone nation here. And then you have a poem here from one of the authors of the textbook. So I think these case studies are worth reading, and you can reference some of these memorials or memoirs, these resources at the end of the chapter for additional reading and understanding. And then you can see the timeline continues here. And it's a lot of dates and it's a lot of information. So I would again, there's a lot of different kinds of laws and acts that are going on that were used against indigenous communities. Here's another one. And see, this one was in favor of California Indians. So, it just depends on what is being referenced. So read through it slowly to see what information stands out to you. The next section is some of the core concepts and theories within American Indian or Native American studies. I have already mentioned the term sovereignty. So it's this notion of being able to have your dominant power or supreme authority in how you run your community and your people. And in essence, we're really looking at tribal sovereignty. So how can indigenous communities have sovereignty here in the United States while they're living under U.S. law, and they have a unique situation in which they have been granted sovereignty to run their reservations and the communities differently than we see in the U.S. frame. But when something gets in the way, like the Dakota Pipeline, sovereignty is called into question and it is taken away by a greater power, so to speak, if you're looking at the U.S. government as a larger entity. Again, self-determination. It's a way of exercising your own self-governance, making your own decisions. You don't need the U.S. government to determine what your schools should be like. And so you see here, tribes institute their own court systems, have their own tribal police, develop their own K through 12 tribal schools, tribal colleges. These are all acts of self-determination and sovereignty. And whether the U.S. government actually allows these opportunities is another matter. So it takes us into the historical context of colonization and colonialism, in which white Western groups of people came and took over an area and pushed the natives out, pushed the first peoples out in order to utilize the resources, the land, to stake claims, and then even to use, to some degree, the indigenous peoples themselves as forms of labor. And so you end up in a situation, and here's the reference to the Dakota Access Pipeline that I was talking about, that is just north of Standing Rock Reservation. It says in February of 2022, very recent, the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe withdrew as a cooperating agency from the U.S. federal government's ongoing environmental assessment of the Dakota Access Pipeline, citing lack of transparency by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The reason for the withdrawal was due to concerns raised about an inadequate emergency response plan in case a large spill occurred affecting the tribe's water supply. So you see the continuous fight that indigenous groups have against our federal government to maintain homelands and their limited resources and clean water. And although the government says you have sovereignty to practice your ways of being on these reservation lands, when it gets in the way of U.S. progress, you see a different narrative coming forth. And this leads us to understanding what it means to have a settler colonialism involvement in terms of a group or culture that is actively occupying and destroying another group's, usually a native people's, culture and ways of life, who occupied a space before colonization or before settlement. And so this theft, so you see right here, also includes the power to re-identify the indigenous population and subsume an important piece of their identity as being the rightful inhabitants of this land, and thereby reinforcing racist nativism. These are three important points relating to settler colonialism, and we're going to talk a little bit about this one coming up, Manifest Destiny. And in essence, it's a way of maintaining power and maintaining resources rather than rectifying harms that have been dealt to First Peoples or First Nations. And so you see here some information from the United Nations about genocide and about how what is occurring right now, it can be an act of or a form of genocide that continues to be committed against Native peoples. Doesn't necessarily have to be just a mass murder or the death of a vast number of peoples, although we know that did occur and is still occurring, especially against Indigenous women, young girls, and Two-Spirit individuals, which we will also talk about a little bit later. So then the end of this section talks again about some of the terms that are used in academia to talk about groups of people within Indigenous communities, and then about the political versus racial identities and a tribal critical race theory that is really interesting to consider in terms of a more general or broadly ethnic studies critical race theory. And this one is very specific to tribes and indigenous peoples. Finally, the section ends with a pretty important discussion here on blood quantum and what that means in order to determine membership, something that was imposed by the U.S. federal government to trace race between generations of Native people in order for U.S. federal government to not have to fulfill their treaty obligations to tribes. So it was a way that they could say, well, there's not enough Native people, or not, so then there's no Native tribes, so then we don't need to give them back land. And it was a very high, it's a very high 1/2 or greater blood quantum. And this is interesting because in another comparable sense, you have the one drop rule of African American blood, which states that if a person has a single drop of black blood, that person will be identified as black. This is the one black ancestor rule. So Native peoples have to determine a lot of blood quantum in order to be considered Native, but African American or Black individuals, it's a one drop law. And so this is very complicated. And if you see here, it says, hey, wait a minute, we're disappearing. It's a cartoon emphasizing what this blood quantum law means and how if you intermarry outside of indigenous blood, you're going to not be recognized by the U.S. government. And so I would read this pretty carefully. It's very important in relation to how we might view indigenous communities and tribal enrollment and membership from different tribes. And then it ends with the treaties and some that weren't ratified as well. The next section is about invasion, occupation, imperialism, and hegemony. There's going to be a ton of timeline data in this section. It starts here with 1778, which is the first treaty between the United States and an indigenous group in Delaware. And you see this one goes until 1885, and if you scroll a little further down, here's another one from 1921 to 1948. And then if you scroll again a little down, you will have smaller sidebars with more laws and timelines that you are going to want to know more about, like Public Law 280, and what does it mean? It's passed in 1953, a federal law of the United States that established a method whereby states may assume criminal jurisdiction over reservation Indians and to allow civil litigations that have come under tribal or federal court jurisdiction to be handled by the state courts. So in essence, this means tribes losing their self-determination or their ability to handle court matters, and it has to be taken up by state courts. Again, taking away sovereignty via the indigenous groups. And so you see some of these sidebars are important to note in conjunction with what is being talked about, like the Indian Child Welfare Act. And it's really, can be really heavy. Again, strong content warning as you're reading some of this. There's a lot of forced relocations. The Trail of Tears is talked about, the differences between reservations versus rancherias, and just the forced removal and what that means for different groups of indigenous tribes and the ramifications that we are still dealing with today. So, and then finally, stereotypes, othering, and invisibility about indigenous peoples being wild and dancing Indians, Indians as redskins versus warriors. If you consider mascots and sports mascots, Indian children, how Indians roam the land. This is all very negative presentations. So you'll want to read this more carefully. And then finally, we'll end with the perspectives and future directions. So again, reiterating that Native communities are in fact still here. They have never left. They are fighting for their rights continuously. They are practicing decolonization and healing and ways of letting go of some of the traumas associated with colonization, and having some really intense advocacy and battles. So you're going to see land, water, mineral rights up at the top. You'll have, again, Indian Reorganization Act passed by U.S. Congress in 1934. You're going to just see the historical trajectory. And again, you see another sidebar with a long timeline that goes up till 2007 with lots of court cases, different kinds of laws, Environmental Protection Agency issues tribal policy. So again, you're going to want to read these closely. The Dakota Pipeline is brought up again here as well. And so is the, I had mentioned, oh, this is a long timeline here. Alcatraz is mentioned again, Wounded Knee, different forms of resistance, calling for attention from numerous tribes to demand change from the federal government with how Native peoples are treated. Here is the Standing Rock protest of the Dakota Access Pipeline that I was talking about that has been referenced earlier. And then finally, and Shasta Dam is another big one that's blocking migratory fish from access and affecting the downstream flows in the process. And then the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit movement, often characterized by a red hand over the mouth, which is symbolizing the silence of those that are being trafficked, abused, raped, murdered. And there's some really awful statistics here that you can read about. And again, content warning, if you didn't know that this is happening. And anytime you see that red hand over the face, it's to show it's an Indigenous grassroots effort to restore identity in the public sphere, to show faces and give them voice, even though they have been silenced through whatever is happening in any given area in terms of some of these statistics. And then finally, the Land Back movement and Indian education. There's been some revitalization movements, especially with culture and language being key, recognizing the different and very vast Indigenous languages. So there's some positive resistance. Here's hip hop and the American Indians as well. So that's about it for this chapter. I'm going to keep going. The conclusion has all the points you should have gotten from the chapter, including the key terms and definitions here. I'm going to move us to the next chapter. So to access it, you would go back up here to the top. And it says Introduction to Ethnic Studies. Here we are. I'm going to pause for a minute because this is where our break will be. And we are on to Chapter 5, Asian American and Pacific Islander Studies. I'm going to try to go fast. It's a long lecture. We're already 23 minutes in. Learning objectives, we're going to go straight to the introduction. Again, it talks about Asian American studies, Pacific Islander studies, the diversity inherent in this, such as Southeast Asian Americans from Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. You can also focus on Arab Americans, Pacific Islander, and mixed race Asian Americans. It's very, very diverse. It's important to know that they're using the terms interchangeably here in this chapter. And sometimes you might see the word or the phrasing oceanic studies as well, which captures those in Hawaii and other oceanic areas in terms of travel, like Tahiti and Fiji and whatnot. And then, of course, you can have very specific Filipino studies classes. And again, sometimes it is used with an X to indicate non-binary and solidarity with Indigenous communities. So you might have a very specific Asian American class that is not pan-ethnic, but typically for the one we have here at Los Medanos, we have Introduction to Asian American and Pacific Islander Studies. It is pan-ethnic, which means when people of various ethnicities are grouped together, largely for political reasons. And this happened, because of different acts and solidarity movements that caused the groups to come together to strengthen some of the issues they're fighting for. But you can see how diverse the populations are here and how different they are. So you don't want to say that someone who's Japanese is the same as someone who is Taiwanese. These are very distinct ways of being and knowledge production within any group, even though it's a large pan-ethnic category. You have anti-Asian racism in the time of COVID-19. This section is particularly important because I think it is most relevant in terms of what has happened in our most recent memories, in which Donald Trump publicly referred to COVID-19 as a Chinese virus. And then suddenly you have a whole bunch of hate happening to the AAPI community, and a lot of anti-Asian violence, in which anyone that looked a certain way was considered, quote, Chinese, or the reason so many people were sick and dying. And this media presentation was absolutely devastating. We know that it's not true, and yet the discrimination was very real, the lived experiences, and they still continue, unfortunately, to today. And then this early chapter, or this early section, also talks about the Pan-Asian American movement. I do want to point out that this is related to the Power of the People Won't Stop legacy of the Third World Liberation Front in Berkeley. So you have, again, some really awful things happening. This, in particular, Detroit, Michigan, content warning again for terms, and this is the reaction. Like I said, third world solidarity. So coming together and fighting back and demanding representation in academia, rejecting terms about Orientalism or Oriental studies because it smacks of European colonialism and imperialism, and we'll talk about Orientalism coming up. You have a really awesome sidebar about Richard Akoki and the Asian American Black Panther and his involvement with working with Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton, who started the Black Panther Party. So, I mean, and here's the Orientalism that I was talking about. I mean, this is a really powerful key section for understanding the trajectory of the field. So Orientalism is a way that the West defined, quote, the Orient, which doesn't exist. It's a combination of a whole bunch of countries and peoples, and it was often tied with English, with the way people spoke English, and it was, again, a Western invention. And one of the key theorists who talks about this is Edward Said. So you have his description of what Orientalism means, and yeah, I mean, this is just huge chapter. There's some things about the model minority in which Asian Americans are seen as the stereotype of being smarter, economically well off, successful, obedient, docile. This is how other minorities should act, and privileging one group over others, and it creating friction between different groups, and it, of course, not being true. And then finally, they end with the hypersexualization of Asian women in media. And they give some really important examples from very recent films and operas, and you can see the list here. One thing I would also like to say that they don't talk about in this section is that Asian males are also depicted a certain way in media. They're seen as comic relief. They're seen as jokes. Their English or broken English is mocked. They're not seen as masculine. They're often side characters or de-emphasized and in the background. So you have one group within the community, the women that are brought forth in a fetishization as being exotic women that you want to have relations with, and they act a certain way. And then you have the males within the community being left out of the limelight in any given fashion and de-emphasized. But they don't talk about the male perspective here, so I just wanted to bring that up. And then, unfortunately, again, hate incidents after COVID-19, the slaughter of 8 people in Atlanta, Georgia, across 3 Asian massage parlors, 6 of the victims being Asian American women. I don't know if you remember this. It happened in 2021. It was absolutely just devastating to hear about this and feeling so helpless with how media is presenting these women and girls. And here's the results. You have someone taking, quote, the law into their own hands, and you have the killings that occur. Again, content warning for these chapters. Next, we get into some of the immigration and exclusion laws. There is a lot here. If you've never read a lot of the history in terms of your U.S. histories, this is a good, key ones that you're going to want to know. So you have 1882 with the Chinese Exclusion Act. They talk a little bit about it here. You have the 1907 Gentleman's Agreement with picture brides here. And then more Immigration Act in 1924. Another one in 1965. So oftentimes the immigration acts were used to prevent individuals from easily accessing the United States, having to go through all these hoops and jumps, and then only being allowed to work in certain segments. Like you might have a lot of Chinese immigrants working on the railroad systems and really hard and dangerous labors, and then immediately expelled after the labor's done. So some of that stuff is talked about here, and so is the Hawaii plantation labor with sugar plantations. A lot of different Asian immigrants were coming to Hawaii and working these awful backbreaking jobs on the islands, and that's how you have quite a Pan-Asian influence even in Hawaii. And then I think one thing that's really important to point out here is that activism is still occurring. So this sidebar in particular with Philip Vera Cruz is amazing. It highlights the vice president of the United Farm Workers Union, who was working alongside Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, Larry Itilang. It's another way to show you that the efforts were united across the different racial groups when they're demanding equitable work, accommodations and wages. They're working together, and through that combined effort, more changes are enacted. You have a little bit about nursing and why nursing becomes such a high, in terms of high Filipino makeup for nurses. It says right here, they make up the second largest group of the state's active nursing workforce, and that U.S. colonization greatly contributed to this. So you can read a little bit about that. And then, of course, you have the communities making Asian American spaces within the different parts of the United States in order to find community and safety for themselves. So you have Little Manila here in Stockton, California. You have Japantown here in San Francisco. And then you have Chinatown again, also in San Francisco. So this is pretty fascinating to see how groups protect themselves and why they can, quote, self-segregate. This is chosen separation to create these communities that they feel safe in, and it's not necessarily foisted on them. And then finally, it ends with a little bit on undocumented Asian Americans and how there are differences between the Latinx undocumented students and the Asian undocumented students, and how sometimes it enabled more access to be safe, to be less questioned, to just in experiences in general. So it's an interesting section. The next section of the chapter is about wars and imperialism, and then it ends with Pacific Islander studies. I know the lecture is going kind of long. I'm going to speed through this a little faster, but you can see the different subheadings for each war. So they start off with the Philippine-American War and U.S. imperialism. And this is important because you see the white supremacy ideology at play, even in this image, in which multiple racial projects are occurring that that poor whites are always better than non-whites, that these Philippine individuals need to, quote, become white, they need to be civilized, they need to be westernized. And a lot of these wars that you're going to read about in this section all tie back to that manifest destiny ideology that we were talking about in the Native American chapter, about spreading Christianity, about spreading a certain way of being and forcing it on other peoples, usually with the understanding of quote, saving the savage, but saving the Indian, but killing the savage, the famous quote. It's in the chapter on Native American studies. You have the Korean War that's talked about a little bit here. Lasted from 1950 to 1953, but they recognize still technically at war today with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. No peace treaty has ever been signed. There's still military drills. They call this the Forgotten War. And they talk a little bit about the colonization prior to that with Japan, and being forced to speak Japanese and use Japanese names. And then probably the most recent war or history that we all know is, of course, the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, in which we had legalized mass incarceration of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, Canadians, Peruvians. There was a whole bunch of individuals that got arrested, got their lands taken away, were separated from their businesses, their families, and it had catastrophic realities that weren't fixed after World War II was over, that these had lasting effects and caused generations of poverty and loss of income. And it's just an awful, awful time period in our life. This authorization to reprimand them as potentially enemy aliens, anybody that looked Japanese or Japanese American, it was under the guise of what they called a military necessity, and forcefully removed from lots of places over here on the West Coast. And these assembly centers that they were sent to were on fairgrounds, racetracks. They were forced to sleep in horse stalls. It was just awful. And then here you have a recent one, a sidebar, recent meaning in our area with Oakland, from Fred Korimatsu, who was born in Oakland, California. He attempted to avoid the removal order by undergoing plastic surgery. I mean, just awful. Some people say, oh, well, it wasn't as bad as the concentration camps, but a camp is a camp, and there was death, there's, not to the degree, but it's just, these are horrible things that were done in World War II. Again, content warning. You can't compare them, but you can say both are bad. And you can say that this has lasting effects for Japanese Americans and their families for generations. There are those who fought in the war, who resisted. They tried to be recruited in order to maintain their allegiance to the U.S. government, to say that they didn't want to go into these concentration camps or these holding areas. You have a group, the No-No Boys, who said they weren't willing to serve and they weren't willing to swear allegiance, and so they were sent to the segregation center, met with various atrocities. Largest camp turned into maximum security center, barbed wire, tanks. Just, it led to deaths. People went on strikes about it. It's just, again, awful. This whole page is really hard to read. You have the secret wars. These are things we don't necessarily talk about. So I would say the Cambodian genocide, 1975 to 1979. So when you get to this section, please take care as you're reading. It's a lot. It's a lot. I'm going to end with the Pacific Islander Studies section before we hit the summary and review. Again, this is about the Oceania or oceanic peoples. Again, it's diverse. There's a reason that it is Pacific Islander Studies. It says here, it recognizes the relationship to the land, to the earth, to the seas, to one another's. And it's often peoples of a certain area, Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, Pacific Islands. I had mentioned Fahiti and Tahiti, and these are some of the groupings. This field of study can be separate from Asian American studies, although sometimes they are grouped together to give a broader survey, but it can indeed, oceanic studies or introduction to Oceania or oceanic studies can be its own class. There's so much to talk about. You see a little bit of amplifying the Pacific Islander voices and then the differences in what I was talking about here. There's deep marginalization amongst both communities and sharing similar struggles against U.S. imperialism, settler colonialism, white supremacy, all the topics we have spoken about with Native American and Indigenous studies. So this is a great section, especially if you're very much interested in the breaking away from a more pan-ethnic Asian American studies to see some specifics that are different. So read through it. I'm going to end with the summary review. It gives us a reminder of the diverse and long history. All of your key terms are highlighted here, and further activities for comprehension and understanding. So if you have any questions, please, as always, reach out to me on Canvas email. It's the best way to get a hold of me, and we will have some great activities related to this on Canvas or in class. Thank you.